and welcome to this webinar called Reformulate with Confidence, Natural Solutions for Sodium Reduction and Savory Flavor Enhancement. This event is brought to you by Prepared Foods and is sponsored by Daesang. I'm your moderator, Bob Garrison, the Chief Editor at Prepared Foods. Thanks for joining us. Today's presenters are Dave Barnum, Sales Manager at Daesang America, Inc., and Amanda Sinrod, Senior Food Scientist at Mattson. Dave began his career in product development and spent more than 2 years refining his technical expertise before transitioning into ingredient sales after a company acquisition. Holding a degree in food science, and backed by a solid foundation in formulation and product innovation, he has built a successful career spanning more than 30 years in the food ingredient industry. Specializing in the savory segment, Dave has developed an in-depth understanding of flavor systems and functional ingredients. His expertise particularly lies in utilizing Daesang ingredients to enhance umami flavor while maintaining a clean label and reducing sodium content. And all of this, of course, is a critical focus in today's evolving food landscape. Combining strong technical insight with market acumen, Dave has consistently identified new opportunities, driven growth, and cultivated lasting relationships with customers in a very highly competitive market. Amanda joined Mattson in 2021, and since then she's worked with startup and large CPG companies, developing new products, finding novel ingredient applications, and reformulating established products. Amanda spent 3 years reformulating products to reach the FDA's voluntary sodium guidelines. These products spanned 15 different brands across the market, including salad dressings, retorted and frozen meals and sides, sauces, pickles, and even canned meats. Amanda strives to increase food science communication. She has been quoted in the New York Times Magazine, The Daily, NPR's Marketplace, and she's published 12 peer-reviewed articles and 4 industry magazine articles. Before coming to Mattson, Amanda developed products and conducted research at the United States Department of Agriculture in the Agricultural Research Service and at the University of California, Davis. In her products, she worked to decrease food waste through developing a novel food freezing system and transformed food waste systems into delectable products. Amanda earned her MS in Food Science and Technology from UC Davis and a BS in Chemistry from UC Berkeley's College of Chemistry. For her master's thesis, she discovered potentially prebiotic compounds in wine industry waste. Amanda has won many awards and fellowships during her tenure, but she's most proud of receiving the Diversity and Action Outreach Award from the USDA. So don't forget to submit your questions, and later in our program, our presenters will address as many as possible. Today's event is being recorded and archived at preparedfoods.com. And with that, I'm excited to turn it over to today's first presenter, Dave Barnum.
All right. Well, welcome, everyone. I want to thank, I know everybody's got a busy schedule, and it's tough to fit things like this in, but again, we appreciate it. And I'm going to start off with a little bit of background on Daesang and the Dsavory line, which we're going to present today. So we'll just kind of start going. If I can get these slides. There we go. Nope. Sorry. I'm working on it. So a little bit about Daesang. Their main focus is fermentation. They've been doing it a long time. They basically, obviously it's a Korean company, and they're deep in with the Korean flavor and the Korean products. They started with MSG, and with their innovation, which continues to this day, they came up with the the Dsavory products that we have. And following along with that, they like to keep things with sustainable products. So basically Daesang has they've got more of a retail food service side, a little bit industrial, where they are number one in the world for kimchi production. If you've been to Costco, you've seen the clear in the refrigerated section, the clear, almost a square container of kimchi. That's the Daesang kimchi. They also produce gochujang, which is a fermented chili, doenjang, which is fermented soybean, and they've just started a ready-to-eat take-home meal. The other side, which is our side, the Dsavory line, they do have some other products, the microalgae chlorella. They do make individual amino acids. And they also have a waxy corn starch and a sweetener product. So we will jump into the Dsavory. There's 3 basic Dsavory products. And for those of you that have seen these products, we did a rebranding. And so it used the first 2, the UH and the LH, used to be called Namino, but they figured let's keep it consistent. So they're all Dsavory with the 2 letters following. So the first one, the UH, is high in glutamate, very low, 2% sodium level, where the UH, you get that initial pop when it's used, and it adds the complexity of your product. But it's a good way if you want, especially for snack seasonings, you want a good first pop, use the UH. The LH is high in nucleotide and, again, 2% sodium. And it has the lingering effect, it adds the complexity. It also, it's not listed here, but it can buffer some flavors, mask some flavors. So it's a unique characteristic, but also good for boosting flavor and keeping that lingering flavor on your palate. The third, the MH, is a very unique blend of different aminos. This is primarily, it can be used for other things, but if you're using any kind of protein or protein-based product, it will accentuate and bring out the natural, beef, chicken, pork flavors, which it's really great. And then when your finished product is heated, it brings out a roasted note. So it's a very unique product. And those are the 3 that we're going to be focusing on today. And the last, which is, important these days because of all the label issues and clean label, our product, all the Dsavory, all 3 of them can be labeled as natural flavor compared to the other competitor products out there on the market. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Amanda. She's going to work with some different application methods, formulations, and we'll just take it away, Amanda.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Dave. So now that we have a bit of background on Daesang, let's learn how to reduce sodium in our food applications and then how to utilize Dsavory in doing so. So before diving into that, a little bit about Mattson, which is the company I work for. We are a consultancy of over 65 employee owners. We consist of marketing agents, strategists, chefs, scale-up specialists, and scientists like myself. We really are working to create the future of food by strategizing, commercializing, and developing new products. We can take you wherever you are to wherever you want to go. We can start all the way at developing consumer insights to figure out where the market is going, strategizing, ideating, and all the way through brand strategy to product development and commercialization to get your product on the shelf and into people's homes. We like to joke that we work in 100% share of the stomach, meaning we don't discriminate against food categories or beverage. We will do all of it. So everything from big companies to startups, any temperature state, any meal state, snack state, beverage state, you name it, we'll do it. All right, so now into the meat of the presentation with sodium reduction as a food scientist. So first of all, why do we need to reduce sodium in our foods? The FDA recommends that the average American adult consume 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day to maintain a healthy sodium balance. The average American actually does 1.5 times that by consuming 3,400 milligrams a day. They also found through studies that 70% of this sodium intake is through processed foods and commercialized food production. So sodium is a required micronutrient, as we said. There is a recommended daily intake level. However, the vast majority of Americans are clearly overconsuming sodium chronically. This can lead to a massive host of negative health effects, including high blood pressure, heart failure, heart disease, stroke, kidney disease, kidney failure, kidney stones, certain cancers such as stomach cancer, osteoporosis, and an overall increased risk of mortality. These are many of the issues that are currently plaguing Americans and really impacting both our overall country's health and our healthcare system. So in an effort to combat this and make our country healthier, the FDA decided to try and tackle our sodium overconsumption in a stepwise approach. So this would incrementally lower the sodium in our processed foods, both in CPG and food service, so that Americans will become more accustomed to what lower sodium food tastes like and won't reject their current loved and known products. The first phase of this came out in 2021 and ended in 2024. The FDA looked at all the different food service and CPG categories that we currently have, divided them into subcategories, and established target sodium levels and upper bound sodium levels for every single category based on where they are today. They then set a voluntary guideline for food companies to get their products ideally to that target level, but within that upper bound, within those 2.5 years of that first phase. The second phase draft was released in 2024, where they took those target sodium levels and upper bound sodium levels and shifted them down to a lower sodium limit to complete the second step of the sodium reduction. And this would be the second step of many. This final phase, or the second phase has not been finalized. It's still in the draft status, and it's on hold during the current administration. And the FDA policy will shift due to every administration's priorities and the political climate. So before we can take sodium out of food, we need to know what it's actually doing in the food. The first thing I think of is flavor. So these are compounds like sodium chloride or table salt and monosodium glutamate or MSG. Salt is one of the most impactful flavor ingredients that we have. That's why it's in basically everything. It increases craveability. It enhances the flavors of other foods, which is why you put a little bit of salt, say, in a dessert or baked good. It increases that saltiness and umami flavors in savory dishes. It can balance overall flavor profiles. It adds complexity, and it can mask off notes, such as bitterness or beaniness. Then you have more functional roles of sodium. And the first one that's really a category of its own is food safety. Sodium and sodium-containing compounds are critical in many food safety applications. So you have salt itself, which is a major preservative. It's bactericidal at certain concentrations. But you also have sodium-based nitrates for curing. You have sodium benzoate, which is important in condiments and salad dressings. And then you have the other processing mechanisms that result from your salt percentage. So this could be how much you have to thermally process a retorted product based on your percent salt in the formula, or how much you have to process something based on its water activity, how much of another ingredient, such as sugar, you need to add to get to your correct water activity, or the acidity of a fermented product in order to be fermented safely. Next, we have the general functional sodium-based ingredients, and I think of this as your hidden sodium because you're not tasting it. These are generally the frontline, most affordable functional ingredients are sodium-based. And so these have to be taken into account in order to remove sodium without affecting flavor as much. So you have basically a sodium-based functional ingredient in every category. You have sodium citrate as an emulsifier in cheese sauces, sodium bicarbonate as a leavener in baked goods, sodium chloride, which helps with protein extraction, moisture retention, freezing point modification, boiling point modification, sodium alginate, which is a thickening and gelling agent, sodium hydroxide, which is important for pH modification, and sodium hypochlorite, which is important for bleaching. So now that we know what sodium is doing in our food, we can address formulating and reformulating. Formulating from scratch is generally the easier of the two, and this is because the consumer does not already have an established baseline for what the product will be like. You get to establish that with your product already in its low sodium state. So that removes a major challenge. The process for formulating and reformulating are very similar. So when you're starting to formulate and you're gathering your ingredients, you need to look at their NFPs and figure out which ingredients will contribute sodium and how much sodium will they generate. Then you want to look at how your process transformations will affect sodium. If you're making a cracker, for instance, you're going to bake it, which will drive off the water and concentrate the sodium in the cracker, which will mean you'll have a higher final sodium content. So you need to take that into your calculation when determining how much the sodium you're adding actually affects your final sodium. Then you need to perform iterative development and multiple trial and errors to develop your product as you would for a full sodium, low sodium, or any product you're developing. And then you're going to use the sodium reduction tools to adjust your sodium as needed once you're very close. And we will go over those tools in a bit. Next, we have a stepwise approach for reformulation, which is usually much more challenging than formulating from scratch. The goal of this reformulation is to maintain the taste and eating experience, so both the flavor profile, the texture, and everything of your food, maintaining the cost margins, both from ingredients and processing, not complicating the processing at the plants, and avoiding any kind of safety or technological issues. It's a big ask. Basically, keep the current product, how you make it and how much it costs, but remove the sodium and make it taste the same. So you can't always get all of those, and you need to figure out where the priorities are. This is something we have our clients prioritize, whether it's cost or flavor or processing time. It really varies based on their goals. So once you know your set of goals and their priorities, you start off by figuring out what is your current sodium level and where are you trying to go? What sodium do you need to be under? And this will tell you how much of a sodium drop you need to make and how much work you're going to need to put in. Once you do that, you're going to calculate the sodium contribution for each and every one of your ingredients, which you can do based on your nutrition facts panels and your formula. And with that, you need to analyze and quantify how the processing transformations affect the sodium in each of those ingredients. So we mentioned baking to drive off moisture, but there's also many other ways that a processing transformation can affect your sodium. Say you're using a super cooled chilling brine below the freezing point, and you're using sodium chloride to bring that freezing point down, and you're going to be rinsing off your product, say it's a sausage, in a chill brine in order to cool it down quickly. Osmosis can lead to the sausage absorbing some of that sodium out of that brine bath and increasing the sodium. Same goes in reverse if you're using a salt-packed produce and you're going to be using water to transport it through the factory, or purposely letting it soak in water to remove some of the sodium. Osmosis will leach out some of those sodium chloride ions and will remove some of the sodium with that water. So there might not always be a linear calculation for how the transformation is affecting the sodium. You might need to go in and collect data to figure out what the before, after, and middle sodium levels are. Next, you're going to test the different sodium reduction solutions to try and get to your target sodium level in your final product. There are two categories I divide this into, which we'll go into in more depth. The first one that I target is the functional sodium sources, or those hidden sodium sources, and then the flavorful sodium sources, because the consumer will notice those more. So our functional sodium in our foods. As I mentioned, sodium ingredients are usually the first ones that people use in their functional ingredients. This is because sodium is easily consumed and it's cheap. Sodium is an alkali metal in the group 1 of the periodic table, as you can see in the upper left, and it is highly edible. We both enjoy it and we need it in our diets. So it makes sense that a sodium ion is a great carrier for many functional ingredients that have a single negative charge. Because of that, that means that we're readily using them. But because of sodium's inherent attributes as an alkali metal, it means it can be replaced by another edible alkali metal, like potassium. So there are potassium substitutes for many sodium-based functional ingredients. So for emulsifiers, you can go from sodium citrate to potassium citrate in a cheese sauce, go from sodium bicarbonate to potassium bicarbonate in baking for leavening, and from sodium chloride to potassium chloride in protein extraction in emulsified meat products. Now, there are a few watch-outs when you're making these substitutions. The functionality may be different, even though they are similar compounds, right? So it will probably not be a one-for-one replacement. You will need to do different trials in order to optimize the functional usage level in your product. Another thing that you'll need to take into mind is molarity. You'll need to go back to your high school and college chemistry classes and think about how many moles of the functional component of the ingredient that you're adding. So say you're making a meat emulsion to make a hot dog. You are adding 100 grams of sodium chloride to your batch in order to have those chloride ions in the meat emulsion, extracting the protein to make it nice and sticky so the mass can hold together in that sausage casing through the rest of the process. Well, from that 100 grams of sodium chloride, you are getting 1.7 moles of chloride ions. If you need to replace sodium chloride with potassium chloride, potassium is a heavier element than sodium. So in order to get the same 1.7 moles of chloride ions, you're going to actually need to use 128 grams of potassium chloride. So you need to both do the math and do the benchtop testing and plant testing to make sure you're achieving the optimum functionality for your ingredient replacement. Another thing to note is that often these heavier and sometimes more rare functional ingredients that do not contain sodium may be more expensive. So not only are you using more on a pound scale, each pound may be more expensive. So if cost is a big constraint, that's something to really take into consideration. And there may be multiple options for you to choose between. Next, we have flavorful sodium. So once I have removed as much sodium as I can within my cost and label constraints from the functional side, I move on to flavor. What I like to do is I make up a sample of the control, from the original, and then I make up a sample of where I am now, having replaced the sodium from the functional ingredients, and then removing enough of the flavorful sodium from MSG and salt, usually, to reach that sodium target. Then I taste them side by side, and I see how much of a flavor difference is there that I need to make up for. There are 4 different individual options that can happen as a result, or that any combination of these can also happen as well. So first, the flavor could remain similar to control, in which case you're almost done. You might need a few minor tweaks, but you've basically already done it, and you should be very proud of yourself. You've been a success. The next is the flavor could be bland overall, which case you need to overall boost that flavor impact. Usually salt can give a very sharp hit or a salt burn on the tongue. And if you've pulled back the salt, you can be missing that, and the flavor can be less impactful. Another option is the flavor could become unbalanced. When you're creating a flavor profile, you need to balance the sweetness, the saltiness, the acid, the umami, the bitterness, all of that. By removing the saltiness, you can throw off the entire balance of that flavor profile. So you'll need to work both within the current ingredients and maybe adding in new ingredients to rebalance that flavor profile. And then next, off notes can become detectable. Sodium chloride and MSG are both excellent at hiding different off notes. So this could be beaniness, bitterness, metallic flavors. A strong sodium chloride flavor is really great at detracting from those off notes. So now you might be able to taste it, and you need to find a way to cover those up. So the first thing I like to think of when I'm boosting overall flavor is boosting that salt impact, because that's what I'm removing. The first thing most developers reach for is potassium chloride, which I know I've mentioned a couple times for functionality. It is a functional ingredient like sodium chloride, but it also has a similar flavor profile to sodium chloride. It's the only real ingredient that gives a similar salty impact to sodium chloride, and it's pretty cheap in terms of sodium reduction replacements. Unfortunately, it is not clean label, so oftentimes you cannot use it based on your different restrictions. But as part of their effort to reduce sodium overall, the FDA recognized that sodium chloride or potassium chloride would be a big part of those sodium reduction strategies. And so they allowed potassium chloride to be labeled as potassium salt on the ingredient statement. Now, potassium chloride is a great replacement for sodium chloride in many situations, but it does not taste exactly like sodium chloride. It has a similar flavor, but not that same saltiness. And if you're using too much or using it in certain applications, it can give a metallic or bitter off note, which can be hidden with, say, umami boosting agents, but some people are incredibly sensitive to it and can detect it at low levels. That being said, potassium chloride generally works very well in tomato-based applications, like a tomato sauce. It works very well in meat applications, especially inside the meat mix. So think a meatball or a sausage or a luncheon loaf, like a Spam. And it can also work in fatty, cheesy applications like a mac and cheese. The next option is salt-enhancing flavors. So these exist both natural and artificial flavors. Some of them may contain some sodium, depends on the flavor. Many flavor houses sell these, and both their price and their flavor payoff will vary based on the application and the flavor itself. And next, you have low sodium salt or sea salts. Most table salt is purified, and it is straight sodium chloride. Sea salt, they gather seawater and let it evaporate off, and they collect the remaining salts. This is a combination of naturally occurring salts, primarily sodium chloride, but also contains potassium salts, calcium salts, and magnesium salts, to name a few. It does have a significant sodium content because it does contain sodium chloride, but it is lower than traditional salt because it contains those other chloride ions. It is very clean label, as it can be labeled sea salt, which is generally very well accepted, but it's relatively expensive as a solution. It's much more expensive than conventional salt, and it can have minimal sodium impact. So generally, unless you need very minimal sodium reduction, I don't recommend switching to sea salts, only using it kind of as a last attempt to get that little bit of extra saltiness to push it over the edge, or if nothing else is really working. Next, you have boosting the overall flavor impact. And you can do this by utilizing our natural physiology. So we use spices and acids to trigger our different senses. So one is actual nerve triggers. So mustard and garlic trigger the TRPA1 receptors, which give us a physiological sensation. Then you have the spiciness from peppers and acid, which irritate the trigeminal nerve, which also give that tingling that I think we're all familiar with when we eat something that's too hot. we use these at very threshold levels, so we can't identify what it is that's giving us this sensation, and we can't even necessarily say that the sensation is happening, but we are still sending signals to the brain that more is going on than we would otherwise be experiencing. We can also enhance the inherent flavor perception that's already there, such as by using nutmeg to increase the perception of creaminess, or bay leaf to increase the perception of savoriness. Because these are acids and spices, they are extremely clean label and they don't contain any sodium. However, there are several disadvantages. Spices, unfortunately, are relatively expensive. They can also be allergens, such as mustard, and usually they don't give you enough of a flavor impact in order to stand alone as your sodium reduction solution, but they do pair well with other strategies. Next, you have umami impact. This works for pretty much every savory application because umami and salt generally come together in our brains when we're eating something, right? If you're eating something super umami, chances are there's a fair amount of salt in it. So by boosting that umami level, even without boosting the salt, we have an increased salt perception in our brains. And the umami acts to replace salt's craveability, and it can cover off notes. There are several sources of umami that we can use. The first, as I mentioned, is monosodium glutamate, or MSG. This is generally going to be your cheapest option. It is a very clean flavor in terms of its taste. There's not very little baggage. It contributes a little bit of sodium, but normally the amount of sodium is minimal compared to your flavor impact, especially if you're covering off notes. However, MSG is not considered to be a clean label, and many companies do not want it on its label. Next are yeast extracts. There are many companies that produce an immense variety of yeast extracts. These can either be very general flavored yeast extracts, such as just savory or umami type, or they can be very specific, cheesy, beefy, chickeny. They have a very wide price range, and especially at the lower price range, they can contain a very high amount of salt. I've seen up to 40% salt. So you need to make sure you're aware of that before you start adding it to your reduced sodium product, and take that into account in your sodium calculations. Yeast extract is considered to be fairly clean label, and it unfortunately can have flavor baggage in a yeasty off note, or it can affect the color if used at a high level. Some of them are brown or orange, and if you're adding it to, say, a white creamy salad dressing at a high level, it can affect the flavor. And each individual yeast extract varies greatly in every single application and formula matrix. So it's very important to obtain a wide variety of them and test them all in your product to find the right one. Next, you have tomatoes. Tomatoes naturally contain a small amount of sodium and glutamates. Glutamates are an amino acid that conveys the umami flavor. It is obviously very clean label, but it can impact your color and flavor beyond umami because it's normally used at a concentrated rate with tomato paste. Next, you have flavors. These exist both as artificial and natural flavors. Artificial flavors are obviously not clean label, but natural flavors are. They generally have a very clean flavor profile. They may contain sodium, but they may not. And they are a current area of innovation in the flavor industry. So a little bit more about natural savory flavors. Oftentimes they're made with fermentation, but each flavor is worked to isolate specific umami compounds, such as amino acids, including glutamic acid or glutamates, and other nucleotides, to target specific umami flavors and impact timing on the palate. These flavors are relatively clean, without off notes, and they can amplify other flavors in products, such as like salt can do. So it might make something seem more salty or seem more sweet or seem more garlicky, in addition to being more umami. And these flavors are also extremely flexible. There's no maximum usage level. They can be combined with each other in order to get a custom umami flavor profile that you want, and they can be used with many other sodium reduction tools. So Daesang, as Dave mentioned earlier, is a company that has been doing a lot of research into these savory natural flavors. They've utilized their expertise and deep background of fermentation to use fermentation to develop 3 signature savory flavors that are really easily usable to boost your overall umami flavor. So they have 3 flavors. The first is UH for upfront impact. You can see this in the top graph in red. It has an initial really sharp peak in flavor, followed by it tapering off in the middle of your tasting experience. This is ideal for food that you want to have that strong punch of flavor, such as a snack seasoning or a sauce. Next, you have LH flavor. I think of this as the lingering umami. And you see that here in this periwinkle blue, how it has a much later peak in the flavor profile and a much slower taper off for lingering flavor. This enhances the middle and aftertaste, and it's really great for food where you want that lingering craveability to make you go back and take another bite. It adds a lot of balance, a deep taste, and it's really good at enhancing dairy flavors. And then finally, you have MH. This is a much more rounded peak, and it rounds the overall flavor profile, produces some really great balance, richness, and complexity, and also a meaty flavor. It's also really interesting because it's a reaction flavor, so you add it to the food, and as you heat it, it actually has a greater flavor impact. That is very highly noticeable. These 3 flavors are non-GMO product verified, vegan, kosher, halal, allergen-free, and clean label. So a little bit about sodium reduction and using Daesang's Dsavory ingredients. So Daesang hired Mattson to analyze their ingredients and use our deep industry experience to figure out how their ingredients would play in the food and beverage market space. And we developed 6 food applications that showcase Dsavory's ability to enhance umami in foods. So our main takeaways, first with UH, we optimized a ranch dressing and a barbecue sauce with this flavor. We did, in fact, find that it had a strong upfront flavor impact. It also acted really well in the ranch dressing as an MSG replacement. It boosted the overall brightness and acidity and spice of both applications and rounded flavors. We compared it against many yeast extract and natural flavor competitors, and we found that it both outperformed its competitors in both applications in terms of flavor, and it also was highly cost competitive. Next, for LH, we optimized this for nacho chip seasoning and a chicken noodle soup. We found that the LH was really great in terms of adding complexity and savoriness, as well as a rounded depth. In the nacho cheese, it really boosted those aged cheesy notes and the nacho flavor, whereas in the chicken noodle soup and the broth, it made it taste much more complex, deep, rich flavor, like it had been cooked for a long time, and like the broth had been made from a roasted chicken versus just a chicken breast. And once again, the LH outperformed its competitors in both applications and was cost competitive. Next, for MH, we developed a beef empanada handheld to represent an on-the-go snack, as well as a creamy garlic chicken pasta skillet meal. And we found it worked really well in both applications. It increased the beefiness and the depth and complexity of flavor in the empanada filling. It also made the pastry surrounding that filling taste more buttery and succulent and much more premium. In the pasta dish, it made the creamy sauce much deeper in flavor, enriched the umami. It also boosted the creamy dairy notes as well as the Parmesan cheese flavor. Both of these, once again, outperformed all other competitors and were very cost effective. So here are some of our overall takeaways. They work really well in savory enhancement for MSG replacement or generally just boosting the overall umami and kokumi flavors. and they are on par or better than their competitors, both in flavor and cost. They are clean labeled just as natural flavors, which can be much more appealing to consumers versus yeast extract or artificial flavors or MSG. And then we went and started looking at them for sodium reduction. What we found was sodium reduction worked really well with these three ingredients and maintained the flavor integrity and complexity while being a cost-effective sodium reduction tool. So we looked at sodium reduction in both the nacho chip and the creamy garlic sauce for the pasta. What we did was we established our baseline control that did not contain any Dsavory ingredients and was full sodium. We then made a 25% sodium reduction version with removing the sodium chloride as the only change. And we chose this level because a 25% sodium reduction is the amount you need minimum to make a reduced sodium or low sodium claim on front of pack compared to a regular product. So we did that. And then we replaced that sodium first with potassium chloride to see how that solution would work, then only with 1 to 2 Dsavory ingredients, and then both with Dsavory and potassium chloride. We had a trained panel of food industry professionals with 10 people tasting all of these with a registered baseline set and an agreed upon vocabulary. So you can see here the results for the nacho cheese chips. The full sodium control is in black. The reduced sodium with potassium chloride is in red. The reduced sodium with only Dsavory is in blue. And then the reduced sodium with both Dsavory and potassium chloride is in purple. What you can see here when we added potassium chloride as the sodium reduction tool is that it really threw the flavor off balance. The overall flavor was still lower than the control, even though we added the potassium chloride. It did not fully make up for the saltiness with the removed salt. It increased the acidity. It threw off the cheese flavor while increasing the overall dairy flavor and decreasing the nacho flavor. So it emphasized the wrong dairy notes and not the nacho cheesy notes. It actually muted those, and it added in some bitterness and metallic off notes. When we used just Dsavory, and this was a combination of LH and UH, we actually had a stronger overall flavor impact than the full sodium control. We matched this full sodium control in terms of saltiness and maintained a very similar curve profile all around the spider plot to that full sodium control, while boosting the overall nacho flavor and matching the cheesy flavor, and also increasing the linger time and aftertaste intensity. So this meant that you can actually probably decrease your cheese powders and cheese flavors, which are both very expensive, when using the Dsavory, because it naturally boosts up that nacho and cheese flavor. Then when you combine the Dsavory and potassium chloride, we had a really wonderful synergistic result. It had the by far highest overall flavor impact. It had the greatest saltiness level, even above the control. It matched and even boosted slightly the cheese flavor. It boosted the dairy flavor. It had the highest nacho flavor and the strongest and longest aftertaste, which in this case was a positive thing. So we found that potassium chloride muted the cheese flavor and threw off the overall flavor balance. The Dsavory combination of UH and LH boosted those nacho flavors and overall flavors while increasing linger time and intensiness and replaced the saltiness on its own. And it's much closer to the control than the potassium chloride only sample. When combining potassium chloride and Dsavory, they work synergistically together to give the strongest overall flavor profile and nacho flavor, the highest saltiness, and the most complete sensory performance. Next, we did the exact same thing with the garlic cream sauce. Participants tasted this both independently and on pasta. And we found similar results where adding in the potassium chloride only, while it didn't throw off the flavor balance, it certainly muted the overall flavor portfolio. We had the lowest overall flavor impact and the lowest saltiness. We also had the lowest acidity. It did not enhance the general savoriness very much, and it muted the garlic flavor, which is another relatively expensive ingredient. When we used Dsavory, in this case it was Dsavory MH, we saw a much more improved overall flavor profile with a slightly higher overall flavor impact. It's a higher saltiness score, a closer acidity score to our full sodium control. Increased dairy flavor over the full sodium control, and an on par garlic flavor with the control, as well as an increased aftertaste, linger, and intensity. Once again, when we combined potassium chloride and Dsavory MH, we found a really wonderful synergistic effect. It had a much stronger overall flavor versus the full sodium control, and a great deal more saltiness than the overall than the control. We had more savoriness than the full sodium control, and it matched the garlic flavor and boosted the aftertaste, linger, time, and intensity. So potassium chloride didn't fully replace the saltiness in the overall flavor intensity or flavor profile, and it muted the garlic and dairy flavors. Dsavory MH boosted that dairy flavor and more closely mirrored the full sodium control over potassium chloride. And when you were able to put the two together, it increased the overall flavor profile, saltiness, umami, and aftertaste. It most closely mirrored full sodium scores and actually improved it. I want to thank you all for coming today and listening to our talk and learning about sodium reduction. So hopefully together we can continue to make our products lower in sodium for a healthier, happier American public.